Today we have a very special guest, Mette Dyhrberg. She has a very special journey. And I would like you share your experience with our student. You're also the founder of Mymee, which is a digital health monitoring symptom. And I'd like you to explain this more. And what is fascinating for us is at Quantum University, we're very interested in coaching. And this is in some way what you are doing, using this digital health. And I read you are doing tele-coaching, so I'd like to hear more about that. But you can start with your journey first.
So my journey was really not that different from other autoimmune patients initially, in the sense that at 14 I got my first autoimmune condition. I woke up with head-to-toe psoriasis, eczema, and then in my early 20s I was in and out of the ER. And my second half of my 20s, I collected a lot of disease labels. And I think it was at 27, I was unable to walk up a flight of stairs without panting for air. And you kind of just get used to things as it progresses, right? But by 30, I had collected 6 autoimmune conditions. I was not on, biologic drugs, along with a slew of other things. And then one day it all changed, because my doctor's team called me and told me that they had great news, and then proceeded to tell me I wasn't going to die in the immediate future. And at the time I remember thinking, there was just one thought in my head, and it was, if I went to my advisory board and said, we're not going to go bankrupt in the immediate future, I don't have a job. So I asked the question, what are we going to do about my process? To which the answer was, we're happy with your numbers. And I'm a trained economist, and that was simply unacceptable. So I went from being a disempowered patient to being an empowered human being in that instant.
Still with your symptom and still with your
I was still as sick as I had been half an hour earlier, but now I kind of understood there was a shift in responsibility, because I'm embarrassed to say, up until that point, I had gone to the doctors essentially to get them to fix me. And at that moment, I realized I was on my own.
So they were telling you you will be surviving with your problem and your health issue.
At the time, they felt like giving me a quarterly prognosis that I was going to be here. Next quarter was a good news, and to me, there was probably a layer of things. Right, I was not fully aware that my situation was that dire. And secondly, I think I'm so naive and optimistic that I've always thought, we'll find a way. At some point, they will figure it out. But when they were happy with my numbers, that was when I got off the train. So I basically, as mentioned, I'm an economist. I didn't know anything about healthcare. That helped. So what I did instead was I turned my life into numbers. And I basically applied sort of like Deming business model optimization, like process optimization, to my own body. So I looked at my body as a closed-circuit computer system with different processes that needed to be, essentially optimized. And by taking a very complex problem and just making it very simplistic, I was able to sort of debug my own health.
So what was or were the main factor element?
So in my case, I started obsessively tracking, and this was pre-apps and quantified self and all those things. So it was like old school food journaling, and then transferring it into Excel spreadsheets at night. And the beautiful thing about that is you start paying attention. Once you start paying attention, you can actually see the patterns emerge. One of the big aha moments for me was I was on a trip to some family in Phoenix, and we'd get it's like cowboy land. So you get 3 eggs and a steak for breakfast. And if you ever out of hunger, you'll get another steak. And contrary to dietary beliefs, I felt better. And I thought, this is odd. And then I started A/B testing. 2 weeks with only red meat at every meal, and 2 weeks without, on a plant-based diet. And it was clear as day that red meat was to be preferred over not. When I did the A/B testing between, red meat and not red meat, what was the interesting part was I still got it wrong. I got better, but what I didn't realize was that it wasn't because of the red meat. It was because when I eat red meat, I don't eat chicken. And chicken is the biggest trigger for me. So it took me a while. I got it wrong a lot before I got it right. But what I understood over time was that by using the feedback loop of your system and actually listening to the symptoms, you're able to paint a full picture.
And then
that was essentially what I did.
You found your optimum diet this way.
Exactly. So I actually tinkered my way over 16 months out of 6 autoimmune conditions, out of all my drugs.
So what was the makeup of this diet? I know it's personal, but
yeah.
you know.
So in my case, I'm very low on alcohol. I've always had, I have a very hard time detoxing from my liver standpoint. And then no chicken. And, 8 hours of sleep and water. And that was essentially the modeling from the beginning. Over the years, though, I have tinkered other things into my diet. One of them being I've stopped eating gluten. But that actually has nothing to do with whether I'm sick or not. The gluten component is all about cognitive...
more clarity.
Yeah, what I found was actually, I call it my Bank of America moment. You call Bank of America and you know you're going to be on the line for 10 minutes before anyone picks up. But on this particular day, I literally was so agitated by the time the woman picked up that I was apologizing profoundly because I could hear my own tone. And I thought to myself, what is this? And then I started paying more attention to when I got agitated, when I got overwhelmed, and also when I felt a little bit emotionally unstable. And not as in, psych ward, but more like I would be easily rocked. And it didn't take me very long, a couple of weeks of tracking my agitation and overwhelmed up against my dietary intake to see that it was clear correlated with gluten. So that was an easy, I always say like, everything is doable if the price is right. And for someone who uses her brain for everything that I do, it wasn't worth gluten. If it had given me a little stomachache and whatever, in past life before knowing what the ramifications are, I might not have been so interested. But for me, it made a lot of sense. And I still now, I'm the best detector. I'm like the canary in the coal mine now. If somebody have given me gluten, I know immediately.
Yeah, because you find your...
Once you find your equilibrium.
Your equilibrium, your baseline. But how now you translate this in Mymee and digital software?
So essentially what Mymee is, it is a digital therapeutic protocol. We reverse autoimmune disease symptoms through looking at the feedback loop of your own body. So it comprises of 3 components. One is an app for self-reporting. One is a dashboard for the health coaches to interact with the patients. And third, it's algorithms. Because if there's one thing computers are better at than us, it is actually understanding patterns and causality.
So what are the data that in the first phase that collect the apps? Is about the nutrition or your emotional state or?
It really depends on the individual. So the platform is disease agnostic, but it's also tailored to the person in front of the coach. What we've seen is, of course, from an algorithmic point of view, there's certain body process that we are interested in, but we can also see that every individual not only have their story into their problem, but they also have their own language. So, for example, we're doing a chronic pain study with Cornell in New York right now, and Cornell has no pain, mild pain, moderate pain, severe pain. That's the markers that they're interested in. But for the patient, that becomes very subjective. If you have a good day, your pain feels a little bit less and so on. So we actually find discrete measures. And it could be that severe pain for you is you can't get out of a chair. Moderate pain is you can get around, but you can only get around with a little bit of obstacle. Mild pain is, hand ache or whatever it is.
There's a threshold for... Yeah. I remember when I was doing a family practice, I would walk in the retire home and ask, how are you doing today? Yeah. Everybody's well, and and then when you start to check on them, and they're all taking 1,000 pills for different conditions, so on, but everything is fine.
Yeah.
It's like.
But it's also our response, right? You as human beings, we would rather say we're fine, and I think it's a part of the equation is actually to have people listen to themselves. Like a lot of times, even just creating awareness, like, and it goes both ways. Like it's both people who have made so many patterns that they're abiding to that they actually feel more sick than they really are. Like I remember particularly one MS patient who, whenever asked what she did first thing in the morning, she would say, I get my children out of bed at 7:15. And I thought to myself, nobody actually gets their children out of bed first. Like you either brush your teeth, you go to the bathroom, you do something. And at some point I asked, so when is your alarm set for? And she goes, 5 a.m. And I said, so you have 2 hours and 15 minutes unaccounted for. Like, what do you do? She said, well, if I have a bad day, I need that extra time to get ready. And I said, what else do you do? And she goes, oh, nothing. And I said, let's just start. And we started and we mapped out. And she just had so many rules and things that she was doing preemptively. And one of them was that she would put out 2 sets of clothing the night before. One with the, that she would like to wear, and the other would be if she was too weak to button up or shoelaces or something. And I said to her, well, for now, we'll just actually track whether you're wearing your number 1 or your number 2 outfit, because it will give us a baseline of how your overall health is. And after the first 30 days, I asked her, how many days do you think you had that were bad days? And she said, it's been a good month. I think 12 to 13. And I said, 2. You had 2 bad days, but you've made your life into this whole range of rules.
Every day.
That it feels like every day almost is the bad day. So what we did was actually just simplify it so that she has a drawer in her house. In that drawer, there's a seasonal appropriate outfit for a bad day. Because the one thing we know is that sleep is highly correlated with MS. And she was robbing herself for 60 hours of sleep monthly.
Wow.
For 2 days a month.
So, in other words, it's like you create an aha moment for people.
Yeah.
About
we use the data to create these insights about their own life. And if you, for example, we had a woman come in who her only thing was dairy. That's always like the easiest thing, right? The highest denominator. Everybody kind of thinks, oh yeah, dairy is bad anyways, right? And she comes in. And she kind of knew that dairy was a trigger, but she also kind of thought that she had 100 other things that she couldn't do. So if you have 100 rules, you're intermittently cheating on all of them because you don't really know what's happening. So when we actually cut it down and said it's only dairy, that's the one thing that you have to be off, her health kind of shifted fast. So we don't really look at it so much as MS, RA, lupus, and so on. We really see across autoimmunity. The idea of making these archetypes actually doesn't work very well for autoimmunity. But the one thing that we can say is that if you're having lupus patients through the program, they stay the entirety of the 16 weeks. Whereas RA patients, we very rarely see them beyond 10 weeks. So we know that we can reverse RA faster than we can reverse lupus. Does it mean that we're more successful in RA? Maybe it's faster, but
is it because the psychosomatic component is more important?
For lupus patients, there's a lot of inflammation of the brain, so their addiction is higher. And I think it's one of the pieces that we don't talk a lot about is food addiction. We see
this is
yeah, we really see that the patients who come, it doesn't matter if it's broccoli or nightshades or whatever they are allergic to. Or having a response to, they're highly addicted. And the craziest example was a woman who completely reversed her lupus by cutting out nightshades. And then her first vacation...
Cutting what?
Nightshades. Potatoes, tomatoes, eggplant, tobacco. And she completely reversed her life. And she was somebody who had been so sick that when pulling a sheet over her body, she would scream in pain. And yet, her very first vacation abroad, we could see something was off. And her doctor called and said, I think she's getting sick. Should we call her? And I said, no, make a report, put it in a drawer, put a date on it. And he goes, but we can't do that, the responsibility. And I said, what happens with your other patients when they go on vacation? He goes, nothing. And I said, so what's the difference? He goes, I know about it. And I said, but it's her, she's living her life. It's, make the report and then we'll see where we land. And she came back from this vacation, her hands was like balloons. We knew that it
my.
was really bad.
Wow.
And the doctor could take out a report that was made 10 days earlier and say, I kind of foreseen that this would happen. But then I started looking at the data and I was like, sure, she had cheated a little bit and had her triggering food, but it didn't seem to be in the right response rate to those hands. Like that was just more than I would imagine could. So I said, can I talk to her? And he goes, sure. And I said to her, so have you been eating, I actually only asked her 2 questions. I said, so, have you been eating any of your triggers since coming home? No. No, everything that I cheated with is in the report. And I said, okay. I said, so what did you do that's not in the report? And she goes, what do you mean? I said, so you clearly did something and it's not displayed here, but what did you do? And then she looked down and she goes, I started smoking. And I said, oh. I go, have you ever smoked before? She goes, no. And I said, and all of a sudden you got the urge? And she goes, yeah. And I thought to myself, the body is such an intelligent machine that even this person who was a non-smoker took up smoking when we took the nightshades in her diet away. But it says something about the addiction loop.
Find another way to...
You will find a way, right? It's
Yeah.
like, but it's pretty phenomenal, right? Because in a way, if we started looking at these triggers from that point of view, we know a lot about addiction. We don't know a lot about necessarily these things, but why don't we just apply what we know from other areas into this area?
So you are tracking nutritional factor, probably also emotional reaction. So what are the spam or...
The span of things, so I would say we start out with diet, mostly just because by getting a snapshot of when people eat and how they eat, you can see, are they somebody who eat at 9, 1, 6 o'clock and have structure? Or are they all over the map? Have they ever seen a vegetable? Or are they what I call dashboard diners? Everything is eaten out of the car. That gives us an understanding of the personality before we start the program. But then once the program starts, bowel movements, symptoms, mood, there's a lot of different factors that we track, but we never track all of them at the same time. It's a very slow introduction of new things because I believe that anything that overwhelms just shuts down. So if I, for example, know that you've been constipated since 82, I'm not going to look for triggers. I'm just going to figure out how we can actually get your system working again. And then once we have your system working, then we'll start looking at symptoms up against your dietary or... I think it's quite important actually to take small steps, make that process
it's
optimization.
like, as you said, an ABC thing.
Yeah.
So you try to check one at a time.
Yeah.
So Mymee is, are you training coaches or?
Yeah, so we have an internal staff of coaches and they're all former patients who has reversed autoimmunity for themselves, MS, fibromyalgia.
So this represent how many coaches?
So right now we only have 6 coaches.
Okay. And you're based in New York? Or?
Yes.
And is this software available on apps or how does this work?
So
is there anybody coach could have access to this software? Or?
In the past, the intention was actually to sell as a software as a service. But because of coaches and doctors' business models, it just didn't really pan out that way. There was a lot of interest, but people weren't really willing to pay for the software. And then we started giving it away and training doctors because we thought if we get adoption, then at some point we'll figure out the business side of it. And what we saw was that doctors couldn't actually replicate our results. Coaches could,
they don't have the time to coach.
And then we just decided that there's too many patients that are not being treated while we are trying to figure this out. And then we started hiring coaches to do it in-house. What we're doing now is actually 100% at risk. So we go out to payers and take on populations, and then we only get paid if we reverse cost. Yeah, so we put our money where our mouth is.
And how long it will take to train someone to be, adjust with your...
It's very important that we actually take the health coaching extremely serious.
Absolutely.
Because that's the layer that's going to save the patients that are falling through the cracks. You can have the nicest doctor in the world, but if he has 7 minutes to see you, your life is being led between those doctor's visits.
And another thing too is this element of feedback. It's like, you try to, train or educate people with lifestyle and change of diet. But now if you don't have this loop where you connect with if it's the case of an autoimmune disease, it could be any kind of situation, any kind of problem, if you don't have this feedback. And then this is this phenomenon of creating an awareness in the client. I think it's a very important element.
Yeah.
And this is also linked with the idea to empower the client. And I think it's another generation of coach and nutrition when you work with feedback component.
Yeah, but it's actually also how we actually see the changes happen. Is if I just, like when I was sick, I would buy books, try and replicate the results, quite unsuccessfully so, but we always had this idea that we just found the right thing. And we were like a muss through all these different books and so on. But with the feedback loop, it is your system telling us what is right for you. And that means that even the person who's addicted to her ice cream or whatever it is, when you can, and we have this all the time, patients that come in and say, what the best part about Mymee is that I'm symptom-free and I can cheat and get away with it. And my question is always, what do you mean by getting away with it? Because the data shows a very different story. And the moment you can take the data and show a client who thinks she got away with something, that no, you normally have 2 bowel movements a day. And I see that Thursday afternoon you had ice cream. Now we have Monday. You actually haven't had a bowel movement since. And according to the data, in the next 12 to 14 hours, your hands will start to tighten. And they look at you a little bit funny. But 12 hours later, when their hands starts to be painful, the penny drops.
This is what they pay the price.
Yeah. So I think with the pay the price is the perfect right. It's like you buy when the price is right. And if you know that you can keep your hand fully functioning and you can be walking around instead of in a wheelchair, then staying away from ice cream is not so hard. But it's super hard if you don't know what's actually causing things.
So when I was in the medical practice, change behavior and habits is so difficult. And then when the client will walk in, the stories all the time, because I was doing this kind of integrative medicine. So they have seen the specialist and doctor, and they would come with a condition that I knew they would have to change lifestyle. Maybe that was a little bit rude, but this question I will ask at the beginning is like, do you have enough of this? Do you have suffer enough? And they will all look at me very surprised,
Oh, I always...
And the one that could not answer that question, frankly, I said, no, you just come back. I had too many clients now. You have to come back when it's ready. But the point is, it's kind of the doctor approach, it's kind of rude. Now we have technology and this feedback awareness is so important. That's changed things. And what I like in your story, because we also teach in our university this idea of spontaneous healing that come from an awareness, new awareness of the situation. And Deepak Chopra in his book, Spontaneous Healing, described that. It's like overnight, you see the whole situation and then a condition that was incurable then become.
But I think we've had so many times in history where we have those moments where the minute you know something is possible, or like you can't unlearn something. You hear, that's also why I speak at conferences about my patient's story. In a way, I'm so beyond my patient's story. But the reason I keep doing it is because if I, 10 years earlier, had been somewhere and heard my story, I might have reframed my journey. But I never questioned it. I just thought, best doctors in the world equals the best health. And that was clearly an assumption that I should have revisited earlier. But I think, we know a lot more today, and the access to data through Google and through even just like the autonomy of the patient, I think it's changing things quite dramatically.
So will you say, instead the best doctor, the best awareness of myself is my best doctor?
We used to, our old slogan was know myself.
Oh, yeah.
And it comes from heal thyself and know thyself, right? And I fundamentally believe that there's only one person who can be responsible for their own health. You heard at Exponential Medicine over the weekend, be the CEO of your own healthcare. In a sense, unless people take on that role, they're outsourcing. And nobody knows your body better than you. It's actually funny because Mark Hyman...
But still, you need some some mirrors.
Yeah.
You know?
That's what the data is good at.
Because I heard that before, but then, how you get there.
Yeah. So it's interesting you say the mirroring, because the way I look at it is we all have what we know to be ourselves, and then we have our doppelganger. And our doppelganger is the data. And the data doesn't lie. The data is actually the reality. And a lot of times, those two are quite far from each other.
Yeah.
I had an ex-boyfriend who always said, I run 4 times a week. And at some point I asked him, since when? And he goes, I remember doing it. And I thought it was such a beautiful example of how...
I'm sorry.
Because he felt he was a runner. Maybe it had been a little while since he's actually been on the road 4 times. But it shows you, we think of ourselves... If you ask somebody what you eat on an average day, 90% of Americans eat oatmeal. I promise you, 90% of Americans do not eat oatmeal. But they've done it. And they know that that's a healthy diet. But then they have exceptions. But if the exceptions is 6 days out of 7, then the exception is actually how your normal day looks like. But your brain plays us. So we constantly, what I aim to do with the data is actually make those 2 tracks come closer. They'll never be completely overlapping because our brain will always play tricks on us.
Play some tricks, yeah.
But I think Mark Hyman had it best when he heard about what we do. He said, this is brilliant because the best doctor in the room is always your own body. And I think that's why the feedback loop is so interesting, because your own body knows, and the body signaling is actually what drives this process. So I'm a health detective, and I listen to all the things that are being ignored, like the small signals and things that people don't really pay attention to. So it often means that when I sit on airplanes, I kind of in 20 minutes figure out what's wrong with somebody. And this one time I sat next to these 2 Norwegians, and one looked like he was an Ironman, and the other one didn't look like that. And I asked them what they'd done, and they said, we did this 270-mile bike race. And my face, I really try hard not to be judgmental, but must have shown my utter confusion, because the one who didn't look like he'd done an Ironman said, I know I'm fat. And I said, I didn't think that. And he goes, it's fine, I know. And I said, okay. And they go, 270 miles, that's quite a lot of bike riding. And he said, I exercise several times a day and I eat very healthy because my genetics is just so that I'm going to be very overweight. And I was like, So I'm telling him about what we do. And it's a flight from the US to Norway, so we fall asleep. And I'm a really good sleeper. So by the time I wake up, they're like, we're landing in Oslo. It's 10 minutes from, going down. And the guy next to me has a runny nose. And I said, so you know how I said body signaling? I said, the body signaling here is that meal probably is the cause for your runny nose. And he goes, no. Whenever I am about to land, I always have a runny nose. And I said, it's interesting because the rest of this plane are dried up like prunes. And you're sitting here with a runny nose.
He forgot about the meal he had an hour before.
So he goes, we all get off the plane. And right when I'm about to get on the plane to Copenhagen, he catches up to me and he goes, I've thought about what you just said. And he said, I am an engineer by training and I work on oil rigs. So they call me if a fuse goes. But by the time I make it to the oil rig, 4 or 5 fuses have gone. And I can't leave until I figured out which one went first. So what you're telling me is, I just need to figure out which fuse is the one that's causing this. And I said, yeah, and not only that, but it's going to be yeast or gluten. And he goes, how do you know that? And I said, because when I told you the story about body signaling, I mentioned people who sneeze a lot. And your friend started laughing and said, remember at the beer garden? And beer comprised of 2 things. Yes. So I would start there. he, through LinkedIn, reached out later and had lost a ton of weight in no time
Just taking out
just
the
by
yeast.
taking that one component out. And I think that's how we don't view the world. We view the world through these good and bad advices, but they don't necessarily translate into anything that we can measure. We just feel good because we're doing what supposedly is good instead of what we can actually measure. And I think that's why what you're setting out to do here is so amazing, because I think more awareness around the body, and then the actuality of how it's done and the numbers and the stats is how we actually get there.
And I think you solve also one of my major wondering in these years of practice, because the client walk in, and then for me it's like you open a book of their life and story, and then you never know how much of what they are talking is true, because they reveal some aspect of themselves.
Their story about themselves.
And then, but adding this component now, it's like you have, as you said, the detective that can check out, how far the story is from the reality. So, and I think it's a new element that is now appearing in medicine, or manifesting.
Yeah.
So I think can make a huge difference.
I think so too.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
For
Thank you for having me.
Sharing your experience. Thank you.